So hi again, everyone. It's Emma here at Function Point. Thanks so much for joining in today. We're just going to go through a few slides before we get started here, and I am recording today's session. So just a couple of slides to get us going here. Today's session is all about finding your perfect rate. And your hosts today are going to be myself here running in the background, and Mark's going to be doing most of the talking. This is part of our Dollars and Cents webinar series. This is the first of 3. And just a couple of housekeeping items. So again, I'm recording the session. We'll post that later today. Questions are going to be welcome via the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll answer them either in writing as we go along, or we will ask Mark to answer those questions as we go as well. A little bit about our agenda. So we're going to be going through what the different rate structures are, what one may work best for your agency. There are 3 different options there. And then Mark, I think, is going to be speaking to a bit about the difference between services, staff, and role rates. Mark, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Oh, you brought up my crime
Have I gone too soon? Did I go too soon? I'll stay back on the agenda here. This is a bit of a new presentation, so we maybe needed a bit of practice, but
Oh, you're good.
okay. Okay, so Mark, what's the game plan today then?
Yeah, so we're going to be going through everything about rates. So what we're first going to be doing is talking about how to set and establish your rates. There's a lot of information there, and because I want to make sure that we focus on system aspects of things too, I'm going to go through it probably with a brisk pace, and then once we've talked about ways of establishing your rates, we're then going to get into where they go in the system. I'm going to give a really clear explanation of exactly how every aspect of the system interacts with the rates in the admin section. So in what situation is the system going to look to the different rate areas in order to determine what rate to use in order to place a value on estimated or actual time. And so just so everybody knows, what we decided to kind of do today to make this easy on ourselves is we have a bit of some slides to go through. I'm going to talk about the slides. And Emma, my co-pilot, is actually going to be controlling those slides, and then once we're done that, she's going to give control over to me, and I'm going to pick it up with the system. We thought that would be the easiest way. And then towards the end, I might throw it back to her, and she'll put up just a couple of the closing slides. So for the sake of time, I want to jump right in here. As Emma mentioned, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to ask them in the GoToWebinar questions panel. Any question that we can get to today, we will. Anything that we can't, we'll do our best to follow up with you and provide answers after the webinar. And there's going to be other information in the follow-up email as well. So let's go ahead and jump to the crime baby slide. I threw this together just a few minutes before the webinar. Actually, thought I'd throw it up there just to kind of talk about it a little bit. I preach about this a lot. Tracking time, how important it is for your agency. A lot of the agencies on the webinar today, I bet, just from my experience with talking with all of you, are charging their clients based on a fixed fee, and that is a lot of different titles depending on who you are and what you're used to. So some people will call it project-based, some people will call it milestone billing, some people will call it a fixed fee or a flat price. Essentially, most of the agencies I'm speaking with today are providing an estimate to a client, and they intend to stick with that estimate. They are going to bill them maybe 50% up front and 50% upon completion, or some other variation of that. And if they happen to go over, then they're going to eat that cost. Or if they happen to come under, then hooray, it just grows their profit. And of course, there's different circumstances. Maybe if the client sends in a request that adjusts the scope of work, you might send a change order back to them and outline what those changes are and request for them to sign that. And if they do, then you'll be able to capture for the additional work that you're having to do on the job based on clients requesting things that are out of the initial scope. But one thing that I preach about a lot, I talk about a lot, especially with new agencies, is the importance to track your time, even if you're not billing your time. It's difficult to understand where you're making your money and the profitability of your work if you're not tracking your time. It's easy to look at the end of the year and look at your total invoicing for the year and look at the cost of salary and overhead and determine how profitable you were that year. But determining where the profit is coming from is difficult to do unless you're tracking time. I come back to one example that I was given a year or two back, where an agency told me that after tracking time for a while, when they hadn't been doing it before, they actually shut down their entire events department. They were doing events for local companies, and they figured out that they're never making money on any of these events. It's just basically a marketing promotional thing for their name, and they determined that it wasn't worth it for them. They learned that from tracking their time. So even if you are not necessarily billing your time, maybe it's a retainer structure as well, where you have a set dollar amount you're charging every month. Tracking your time is going to allow you to understand where the profit's actually coming from and if those jobs are worth it. Maybe if you should be charging more, or perhaps maybe even less if you want to be a bit more competitive. So let's go ahead and jump into the next slide here. So before you determine your rates, what rates do you need to know? So there's 3 rates we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to show you where they fit in the system as well. So the agency blended rate. You have to have an agency blended rate. You have to know, what is the default value applied to an hour of time if no other factors are contributing, or if if you happen to not allow other factors such as staff or departments to contribute or affect things. What is the standard agency blended rate? You really need to have this established. I'm going to show you how to do that today. We then have the individual staff rates. This is something that you should know and you should be aware of. So you should know and understand what the billing rates should or could or would be for each of your individual staff if you were to charge for them in that way. If you don't either charge for your time based on staff rates, or you don't even value the time, so if you're charging that fixed fee, but you're tracking time to understand the value of the work, even if you don't value the time based on individual staff and you just use the blended rate, which is totally fine, and in some cases I recommend it, you should still know what that value is. We then have role and / department rates, and this could you could even look at this as almost like a individual service rate, but I'm going to call it role department rate today. And this is a nice to have, and it's not crucial unless it is. And what I mean by that is, if your style of estimating requires you to know a rate that is essentially a blended rate for each department or role, I'm going to show you how this comes up in estimating in the system today. If this is important to you, then you need to know it. If you don't estimate that way and you don't really operate that way, or if your staff are so cross-departmental, if they wear so many hats that it just doesn't make sense, which I know is the case for a lot of agencies, then you don't really have to worry about it too much, but it is a nice to have. So let's get into calculating these rates. And again, I'm going to move through this with a brisk pace. I'm going to check in at each of the next 3 slides about questions, but we take screenshots if you want to, so you have this information for later, and then let us know any questions that you do have. But let's jump into the next one. So calculate your agency blended rate. So basically, the way that you're calculating the blended rate is by determining the agency's billing factor and multiplying it by an overhead factor. Now, the data that I'm using here, the examples, the total agency billable salaries and things like that, I'm getting this information from an organization called Second Wind. And Second Wind is an organization that trains agencies on how to be better agencies. It's an organization that we work very closely with. I myself have learned a vast amount from Second Wind, and Tony Mikey's at Second Wind, who runs that organization there. I've learned a lot from them. A lot of our clients have learned a lot from them. I'll talk a bit about them. I'll probably throw up their website towards the end of the webinar. We don't get any kickbacks if you happen to work with them. I just like to mention them because I do get so much of my knowledge from that group. But basically what we're looking at here is the total agency billable salaries. Now this figure is going to vary depending on how your agency is structured. It's meant to be the billable salaries. So if you have a bookkeeper who never under any circumstances is going to be billable for anything, their salary is not included in this calculation. Their salary should be included in your overhead calculation and should be included in your overhead factoring, which we'll talk about today and next week, but they should not be included in the billable salaries. It can get a little bit tricky when you look at things like, say, a traffic manager, and you determine, okay, well, maybe only 30% of a traffic manager's time is going to be billable, so 30% of their salary should be included in that billable salary calculation. I'm keeping it simple here. I'm basically looking at an 18-person agency with 14 full-time billable staff to make the math simple. We're then dividing that total yearly billable hours for all agency staff. So for all billable staff. So I have 14 billable staff, 1,600 hours per billable staff per year, coming out to 22,400 hours. Quick comment on that: 1,600 billable hours for a billable staff person per year is a good target. That's a good number to look at as a target for amount of billable hours for a staff person per year. At 52 weeks per year, you're looking at just over 30 billable hours per week for that staff person. So dividing those numbers gives you your billing factor. In this case, it's 49.11. You then want to multiply this by an overhead factor to get your blended rate. So that 49.11 multiplied by 3 is coming out to just under $150, rounding it up to $150. Now the overhead factor, I'm going to provide a way to calculate your agency-specific overhead factor in a few minutes, but I'm not going to go into depth about it. So I'm going to throw it up if you want to take a screenshot. But 3 is typically accepted by most accountants as a acceptable, very common overhead factor. I would recommend that you find your overhead factor specific to your agency, which I'm going to show you how to do. But 3 is generally accepted as a good overhead factor in most cases. So that is how we're calculating the agency blended rate. Next, we're going to look at an individual staff rate. So let's jump into the next slide here. The individual staff rate is calculated using essentially the same formula. What you're doing is you're taking the employee base pay. Now, it's important to mention that this is the employee base pay. This is not their cost value, including a percentage of overhead. This is how much do you pay them, before taxes deducted. You're then dividing that number by an annual billable hours you expected the employee to generate. So I mentioned 1,600 as a good target. This equals your billing factor. You're multiplying that billing factor by an overhead factor to get the staff rate. In this case, $70,000 divided by 1,600 hours is coming out to just under $44. Multiplying that by an overhead factor of 3, it means that this staff person has a billable rate of 131.25. Let's round it down to 130 to make the math simple for us. So that is how you're calculating the individual staff rate. And again, even if you don't necessarily use these in valuing your work, it's really good to know and understand. And you'll see that evolve as staff people, start to grow with your company and their base grows, and maybe their billable hour targets go up or down depending on where they move in the agency. You're going to see that number fluctuate and change, but you should have that recorded somewhere, even if you don't use it, just so that you understand it. The next thing that we're going to talk about, actually, you know what? My apologies. I'm moving so fast here. I should just check in. Emma, do we have any questions that we might want to address at this time?
Oh, hey, Mark. No, we haven't had any yet, which is fine. Everyone do be encouraged to send them if you've got them. But no, I think you're going at a great pace, Mark. And we are recording here today. So again, if someone needs to listen to this again, it is going to be available probably later today or tomorrow.
Awesome. Okay. Let's jump into the next one here. So calculating the role department rate, you can probably guess how I'm going to recommend that this is done. You're essentially looking at, the role or department as kind of like a mini agency, and then copying the calculation from the first slide, the agency blended rate. Basically what you're doing is you're taking the total salary for that role or department. In this case, I'm looking at a 6-person design team. I came up with $365,000. Now, just to mention how I came up with that, I basically looked at it as like, maybe a creative director who's about, or a lead of that team is about $90,000. I then looked at 2 senior designers, I think I put it at $70,000. Might have been 75, to be honest, I can't remember. And then 3 junior designers coming out at $45,000 per piece. And that's how I came up with that 365. We're then dividing that by the number of annual billable hours you expect the team to generate. That came out to 9,600, and that's 1,600 per person multiplied by 6. Keep in mind, of course, you have to think about this. If you have a department that maybe has 4 billable staff and 1 non-billable staff, you need to take that into account. If you're going to look at, say, your project managers, you need to determine how much of their time is going to be billable. It's going to be much lower than a designer, and you need to factor those into the equation to come up with what is the number of hours you should expect, and what salaries you should include in that calculation. Because if I have a 6-person team and 5 of them are billable and 1 is not, then the person who is not billable, their salary is included in the overhead factor. Their salary is not included in this in the billing factor. So that's important to keep in mind here, that billable versus non-billable is very important in these calculations. So then dividing the 365,000 by 9,600 gives you your billing factor, coming out to 3802. Multiply that by 3, getting 114.06. Round that up to $115. So that's looking at a roll rate for a group of designers. So the next thing I want to talk about really quickly is just how we're getting that overhead factor. So I mentioned overhead factor of 3. That's totally acceptable if you want to just run with that. In fact, I believe that Tony Mikey's at Second Wind, who runs a lot of their seminars, he mentions in their workbook that I reviewed when I was preparing for this webinar that you can just take the 3 and run with it. That's fine. Use an overhead factor of 3. But if you want to know what your agency's overhead factor is, then I totally think that you should do that. You should run that calculation. Let's jump into the next slide, and I'll talk about how you can determine your agency's overhead factor. So your agency's overhead factor is determined by multiplying your agency's expenses. Now, this does not include any kind of direct job costs or outside vendor costs, by the value of the profit you'd like your agency to make this year. You then factor this very large number. So it's really important that you understand that the top value, that $1,029,000 or so dollars, the total business expenses, it's all of your non-job related expenses. So everything from heat to lighting to how much you pay for the coffee machine, entertainment, things like that. But it's also including a percentage of non-billable staff. So if you have a person who is 100% non-billable, then you would include all of their salary. If you have a traffic manager who is, say 70% non-billable, then you would include 70% of their salary in that calculation. Now, what I did to get these numbers is I actually looked at some survey results from Second Wind to look at, what is the total salary of the average 18-person agency in America, and then I took that number, took some of those individuals off of that and added their salaries to the expenses. I also took the average expenses for the average 18-person agency in America. So that's a very real number, including a percentage of non-billable staff. We then looked at our projected 2015 profit. Now that number that you see there, that 469,550, that's actually an average that's actually an average profit amount for agencies in 2014, and it comes out to almost exactly 15% profit margin, which I thought was really cool to see in that survey. So these are some realistic numbers here. So what you're doing is you're taking your total business expenses and you're multiplying it by your projected profit. If you want to use last year's numbers, of course that makes sense too. Use last year's business expenses and last year's profit. That's fine. What you're getting there is, of course, a massive number. You're getting a huge number. You want to then factor that number to get your overhead factor. So notice that massive number there turns into a 4.8 overhead factor. Now, one thing that you're going to notice, that might jump out at you is, okay, well, 4.8. We've been talking. I'm using very realistic numbers here. We're getting a 4.8 overhead factor. I've been using an overhead factor of 3 in the calculations I've been giving as examples. So what would happen to those rates if I used 4.8 over 3? Well, they're going to get really high. And this kind of gives an insight into a very common conversation between, a lead account manager or, the accounts lead of the company and the company, the agency CFO. The agency CFO doing the math and coming up with cost-based billing rates. These are the billing rates we need in order to achieve the profit that we want. Whereas the account manager, the lead account manager is saying, that's pricing is out of the market. That's too high. We're not going to get the business that we need with those rates. The way that you reconcile those two is by becoming more efficient, becoming more productive. If you look at 1,600 billable hours, per billable staff person per year, if you turn that into 1,700 billable hours per year, all of a sudden you're able to drop that overhead factor significantly when you look at that across all of your staff. And that's why running systems like Function Point is so important, so that you're able to capture more of that billable time, and you're able to make your team more efficient and more productive, so that you're able to achieve the same type of profit that you're wanting to, while being able to lower your rates to be more competitive. But that is how you're able to then calculate that overhead factor. I highly recommend you do it for yourselves. Find the staff and the agency blended and the role-based billing factors. Find your agency overhead factor, run those calculations, and you're probably going to find a number that is going to be higher than the rates that you have now, if you do have them. And if you don't, they're probably going to be higher than you were expecting. It's about finding a balance and finding ways to be more productive and efficient in order to be able to lower that overhead factor and still achieve the same type of profits that you're planning on. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take those rates. I'm going to show you where they go in the system and how they affect things. And I'm going to make it extremely clear as best as I can exactly what's going to happen when you do things like enter a timesheet into the system. Where does the rate come from? Where does the system look to find those rates? So before we do that, I just want to check in. Emma, any questions on any of this financial type information, any of these data points at all?
Yeah, we have had a few questions, so thanks everyone for those. First one came in from Tanya asking for some clarification. Is it what you want the agency to make, or what you hope the agency would make, or like the agency to make, or the projected profit? So which one should be used?
That's actually a really good question. It's something that I was struggling with a bit myself. I think a good way to look at it is what you'd like to make, but I think that both are relevant numbers to know. But I think that you should look at it as what would you like to make, and if you're not really sure, I mean, if it's hard for you to say, okay, well, maybe you're a young agency and it's hard for you to project your total AGI for the coming year, and therefore it's hard for you to determine, okay, well, what would 15% of that be, or 18, or 12, or 5, whatever your target is. If that's difficult for you to do, then you might want to use last year's numbers. If you don't have last year's numbers, because again, maybe you're a new agency, you're just starting out, then it's look at it as what you'd like to make. But really, I guess it's kind of up to you as to what you'd want to use. But I think that you should look at it as what the profit you'd like to make in the coming year, and then run the calculations based off that and just see what comes out the other side. I think you're muted there.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I'd unmuted myself. I'm chatting away there.
No
Thanks,
problem.
Mark. So good thing we're in the same room. So we had another one here from Susan. How do you determine outside contractor rates, like copywriters or designers?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to assume that you mean how do you determine the hourly rates of outside contractors or designers? I mean, I'm going to kind of think in terms of the Function Point system here, and I'm going to say typically you'd want to look at it as not so much a rate, but a markup or margin that you want to make on their cost. So, if you're working with an outside contractor, you're working with an outside copywriter, they do a lot of copywriting work for you. Find out, well, you're going to know how much is this person going to charge me per hour for their work, and then determine what kind of margin you want to make on that. So, what I see as pretty common, I hear this a lot, is 100%. So if a copywriter is charging me $50 an hour for every hour of copywriting they do, I'm going to charge $100 an hour for their work. And that's, I guess, slightly different than looking at it as like an overhead factor and a billing factor, because they're not an internal staff person. But I know a lot of agencies have contractors, and I'm doing the bunny ear finger quote thing here, whether they're contractors legally, but they work in the office and they show up there and they work there 9 to 5, 5 days a week. It's just they're just legally contractors, and that's where it gets a little bit difficult. Sometimes they might track time in the system. If they're basically an employee in every sense but the legal sense, then just look at what you charge them per hour, multiply that by the amount of time that you expect them to work for you, look at that as like a salary, and then run the calculation based off the salary. If it's a case where they're not like an employee in every sense of the legal way, and you're calling them maybe once or twice every month or two or something like that to do a little bit of work for you here and there, then just look at it as a markup or what margin you want to make on what they are charging you for their work.
Great. Can I proceed with a few more? Is that all right?
Yeah, go for
Okay,
it.
great. This one came in from Michael saying, we are to include a percentage of non-billable staff. Does this mean in turn that we exclude billable staff?
That's a good question. So when you're including a percentage of non-billable staff, in this case, we're talking about when you're looking at expenses. So when you're looking at the total business expenses, you want to be including non-billable staff, the percentage of them in that calculation, and you want to be not including your billable staff salary. So your billable staff salary is being used to calculate the billing factor. The non-billable staff are being used to calculate the overhead factor because they are an expense. Um, your controller or accountant who is never going to track a billable hour of time ever is overhead. They are not. You're not billing for any of their work. Um, I mean, obviously, in a way, you're making money off what they're doing, but you're not directly billing for it. So they are included in the overhead calculation. Any billable staff are not being included in that calculation. Now, if you want to get really sophisticated about this, then you can start looking at it as percentages, right? So if you have a traffic manager and 70% of their time is non-billable, then 70% of their salary is included in the expense portion of this calculation, and 30% of their salary is included in the billing factor. So Emma, if you could jump back a couple slides here.
Yeah, hang tight.
Thank you.
That
One
one?
more.
One more?
There we go. So calculate your agency blended rate. So total agency billable salaries. So I mentioned earlier, okay, we have a traffic manager and they're 30% billable, 70% non-billable. So 30% of their salary is going to be included in the total agency billable salaries. 70% of their salary is going to be included in the overhead cost. Now, when you look at the number that you see below that, divide the total yearly billable hours for all agency staff. I have 22,400. I made this easy on myself. I basically took 14 people of an 18-person agency and said that they're all billable. Now, of course, no one's 100% billable, so that's why you're looking at 1,600 hours per billable staff. But if you have a traffic manager who is going to be 300 hours billable in the year, then include those 300 hours in that calculation. Include 30% of their salary in part of the billable salaries, and take the other 70% and put that into the agency expenses to calculate the overhead factor. That's getting like really sophisticated with this. Which is great. That's becoming, you're becoming, everything is being very exact. You don't necessarily need to be that exact if you've never really, gone through these types of calculations before. But if you can, then go for it.
Thanks, Mark. So I want to ask one from Lindsay, one from Lisa, and then we'll let you get on with the rest of the presentation. So from Lindsay, would it be beneficial to give a conservative, air quotes, projected profit, meaning the overhead factor would be higher?
That's an interesting question. So if you have typically the higher the profit, the higher the overhead factor is going to need to be. Basically the profit is in that calculation is allowing you to determine what does the overhead factor need to be in order to achieve this profit. So if you have a higher profit that you're wanting to achieve, you're going to have a higher overhead factor to multiply your billing factors by. It's going to end you up with higher rates. If you have a conservative profit, so if you're basing things off on a conservative amount that you're looking at like a baseline, this is the minimum that we would make that as profit that would be acceptable, then you're going to end up with a lower overhead factor, so that your rates are going to be lower. And it just depends on on how you want to look at this, and how comfortable you are in determining you know what your projected or target profit for the year will be. But I mean, I guess I would probably err on the side of caution. I'd err on the side of being a bit more conservative. But part of this conversation also needs to be with your account managers. If you run these values and you come up with a rate that is lower than what your account managers think that they can sell the agency services for, then by all means bump those rates up. Round it up. Be conservative in the calculation, but then if you end up with something that is lower than what you can get, don't sell yourself short. But I guess I would recommend to be conservative in the calculation, just so that you don't end up with rates that are way too high.
Great, thank you, Mark. This one from Lisa, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but it's a great question. Are there any adjustments that need to be factored in for small design firms versus an agency or a larger firm?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that a lot of this is difficult for a small design firm, because you have such a a cross-departmental workload for each person. A lot of times, I speak with a lot of companies that are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 staff in total, including the owners. And the owner is a creative director. Oftentimes they've left a larger agency, they started up their own, or whatever the case may be, but they are a high billable individual. They're working on, they have their hands in all the pies. They're working on all the jobs, and they might be like a 90% billable resource in the agency, and that is a completely different reality than a 60-person agency. Where the owner is not doing design work on a day-to-day basis. So it definitely changes things a lot. You can, and for smaller agencies, I usually recommend considering everybody, unless, like, if you have a 5-person agency and you have an accountant that they are not going to be billable, of course, but everyone else probably is. The owner is going to be high billable. So just look at run the calculations and the formulas the same way, but just consider everybody to be a billable staff person, and try to have high billable targets for everybody, because you are so small.
Thank you, Mark. Now, would your preference be, we've got a couple more questions that have come in. Do you think we should address those while we're sort of on these slides and in this subject matter, or would you rather loop back on these ones later, or how would you like to proceed?
I'm a little concerned about the time aspect of things. I think I'd like to come back to it.
Okay.
So I think I'd like to jump into the system here. There's actually one more slide I wanted to show. Everybody get your screen grab fingers ready here. If you could go down.
You tell me, you say when. How's that?
There we go. There we go. So here is the 2014 national average hourly billing rates based on a Second Wind annual survey results. You'll notice I mentioned there are data provided by Second Wind. So you can see here all of the positions, and then the average high, and average low billing rates for all of these positions. And this is a great thing just to kind of check out and see where you stand. So everything from $245 on the average high, all the way down to $58 on the average low for admin person. So this is when you run your calculations and you're getting things and you're thinking, it just doesn't make sense. It's too high. It's too low. Where should we be? Well, just consult this chart. Take a screen grab of it, throw it up on the wall or something like that, and just to let everybody know, as far as Second Wind concerned, this is the tip of the iceberg. This is one of the last pages that I reviewed before this webinar, and there is data looking at it from every which direction. Looking at so many different aspects of the agency world, information gathered from thousands of agencies. I think it's thousands. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it's over 1,000. Might be a lot higher, to be honest. I'm not sure. But this is a fantastic resource. I highly recommend checking out Second Wind. Everything I'm talking about today, I learned from those guys. So I do recommend checking it out. I'll throw the website up a little bit later.
Okay, Mark. So now are we, should I pass it to you to be the presenter? Are you going to log us into a system and go from there? How would you like to go from here?
Yes, please. That would be great.
Okay, let me figure out how to do this. Thanks everyone for staying with us here. It's really great information, Mark. You're quite informed.
I appreciate it.
Okay, so I've made you the presenter, so we should be seeing your screen shortly.
Awesome. Thank you. I think I'm not sure if I was unmuted earlier when I rolled over my phone cord with my chair. I had my headset cord. It's pretty long, so it droops on the ground, and I rolled over it with my chair. And when I tried to kind of get it out of there, I almost pulled the phone and the whole computer right off the table.
Holy
And
smokes.
I had to flip the chair over and try to yank it out, like literally 30 seconds before the webinar started.
It's always an adventure with you, Mark. These are
It
always an
is.
adventure.
I make it fun. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. Are you able to see the system that I have open right now?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to be taking you through basically a blank system and showing where the rates go. I chose a blank system because I wanted to make it easy on myself. There's probably a few people that are on this call today that have function point systems with admin sections that scare them. So you might have a whole bunch of rate categories that have been built to accommodate a whole bunch of different situations. You might have a long list of services, some inactive, some active but maybe no longer used, and you might have rates across staff that are all kind of jumbled. I've seen that before. I totally get it. You've done things to accommodate different scenarios. I wanted to use a clean system for today to make the webinar easy to understand. But if you do have a really messy admin section because of different things you've done over time, let us know. Contact us, success@functionpoint.com, and we can provide some help and insight as to ways that you can clean that up. But let's jump into rates here. So first of all, we're going to start with the admin section. And let me actually zoom this in. Let me make this a bit easier to read here. There we go. So we're going to start in the admin section, and we're going to go into rate and staff management. And the first thing we're going to look at is rate categories. Now here we're going to find one category. I have house rate. I recommend having a minimum of 3 rate categories, and no more if you don't need them. So house rate or standard rate or what client standard rate, whatever you want to call it. You then want to have a rush rate or higher rates. I typically find it's about 25 to 50% higher than your house rate. And then a discount rate or friends and family rate or pro bono rate or charity rate, whatever you want to call it. And that can, I see everything from 0 to a cost rate. So maybe you do things at cost for charities or for people that you like. And then maybe there's a discount rate that's maybe 25% lower than your house rate. But it's really easy. You're just giving the category a name and then choosing your default rates and markups. And once that's established, we then go in and apply those rates. But I'm just going to be using just the one rate category here. So the first area, the first most important area is the service rates and markups page. This is where we establish what the rates are for each service for the rate category. So this is where we're going to see a list of all of our rate categories, all of the services that we have. Now the system is a very simple example, and then the rates for that category for those services. Now we determined that the agency blended rate, I believe it was 150. I should know that off by heart, but here it is. It was 150. Yes, it was. So we determined the agency blended rate was 150. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say that our standard rate, our house rate, our default rate when no other factors are contributing is $150 an hour. Notice that I have one item called non-billable. It's going to stay at 0. I'm going to save that. This is the default rate that's going to pop in any case, again, where no other factors like staff or role rates are contributing to things. So this is where you want to make sure, first and foremost, you have clean and it looks good and it makes sense to you. So there's our 150 agency blended rate. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the Manage Staff Rates page. Now we can access it from here, or we can go into the admin section and then choose staff rates and permissions. And then for one of these individuals, click on their rates. And I just threw in a couple staff here. I kept it small again for my own ease in this webinar. Just there's only a couple individuals in here. But what we have here is a very, very important area of the system. This is the Manage Staff Rates page. Now, this is actually where the system is going to look anytime a timesheet is entered in the system. This area must be as clean as possible. You can't have any problems, errors, or issues in here. I highly recommend after the webinar you go and you review this page and make sure everything is looking okay. What we have is each individual, and for each individual, what their rates are. Now notice that I have each of the services, and I then have a blank box, and I then have $150. So what this is doing is this is showing me for this rate category. Now, if I had multiple rate categories, I would see them here. I just have one. For this rate category, the default rate is $150. We just established that. This box is the rate for this specific staff person. So Laura Boyd, if she puts a timesheet to account service, the system is going to look to this box. If it does not find anything, it's going to look to this value, which is the rates that we just put into the apply rates and services page, or the service rates and markups. So it's going to look here. Essentially, if you do not have staff rates, every box should be blank. If you get here and you find something wonky, you come in here and you're finding stuff like this, I mean, I've seen that in the cases in the past where people have gone in here and gotten creative with the individual staff rates, even though it wasn't really necessary, and then they're looking at some reports and can't figure out why there's values that are kind of across the board. If you come in here and you find something like this, all you need to do is click the Apply Rate button. Because what we're saying here is, well, if Laura Boyd was that designer that we determined had a rate of 130, and we want to use that 130, then I'm going to apply that rate, but I'm going to blank out non-billable because I want that to come in as 0. But everything else, the system's going to look here and find 130, and that's the rate it's going to use. If I myself do not have my own rates, I use the agency blended rate, then I would leave this blank. If I have a higher rate, if I'm a senior individual, and we would say, okay, well, maybe I'm the principal. I'm the creative director, I'm / owner of the agency, and anytime I work on something, it's actually going to be $200 per hour, except for the non-billable. The system is going to look here. So this is very, very important. I highly recommend you review this page and make sure that nothing wonky has been done with it. Any questions on these specific things around rates in the system at all at this time?
No, nothing around there. Thank you, though.
Okay, no problem. So the next thing that we're going to look at is roll rates. And after we've done that, we're going to open up an estimate. I'm going to show you how these things work. So let's save that. And I think Laura's at 130. That's fine. We'll save her too. The next thing we're going to do is go into the admin section, and we're going to look at our roll rates. Now, the roll rates in Function Point are used for one thing and one thing only, and that is estimating. They have no other impact on anything else in the system. They're used exclusively for estimating. I'm going to show you how that works. So if we don't need these, just leave it as blank. It's never going to come up unless you specifically go out of your way to add these into estimates and use their rates. But let's say that, well, our roll rate for the designer was 115. So, we had some junior people in that group, and when we accounted for those junior people's lower salaries and the billing factor, it came out to a lower rate of 115. And then let's say everything else is, 150. Again, this is kind of redundant. I don't even really need to do this. If I'm never going to use it, then I don't need to come here. But if we want to use this for estimating, then we can. I'm going to save that. What I'm going to do is I'm then going to go ahead and I'm going to add an estimate. I'm going to add one for my client, North Shore Auto Group. I'm going to blow through this page super quick. Call this webinar example. Choose any type, doesn't matter. Rate category, house rate. If that was defaulted for the client, it would have filled in. I'm going to leave everything else. I'm just going to select my one category of billable time and move to the next page. So notice here, I thought these were collapsing for me at this time, but they're expanding. So I'm going to collapse them, make it a bit easier to read. But notice here that I have each of my services, and I then have my rate. Now, one thing I actually didn't include in this group was my non-billable service. Let me go ahead and add that really quickly. I want that non-billable item to show up there. There we go, there's non-billable. So here are all of my services, and here are their rates. Now, this is how all the things that we do in the admin section impact things. If I estimate 10 hours here, it's going to multiply by this value and give me and total of $1,500. Now, if I were to choose a specific staff person, so let's say design, let's move design up. And then let's say for design, I'm going to click the plus icon here, and I'm going to say that the design work is being done by Laura. It's being done specifically by Laura. Notice that Laura's rate of 130 has filled in here. I'm going to put in 10 hours. It's going to drop in $1,300. Let's bring up web development above admin as well. Let's say that web development is going to be done by our role of designers. Now let's say in our hypothetical situation that there was 6 of them and their rates are varied. And I don't know if it's going to be a junior person or a senior person or maybe somebody else outside of the department. I have no idea, but I do know it's most likely going to be a designer. The way that the role rates are used is it allows you to choose an individual. I'll actually put in 2. Let's just use 1 here. They might be slowing down a little bit for me. Oh, well, that's fine. We'll keep it with the 2. So for my web development, I'm going to choose the role of designer, and that's going to fill in with the rate here. I apologize. I think we might be slowing down a little bit. Is my voice keeping up with my words? Everything's still moving?
Yeah, you are. Can I just ask a quick question, though, just while you've paused to ask me that? Just for our attendees, because we're coming up on about 10 to, do you have a guesstimation of how much longer we're going to keep people going through this?
Yeah, I'm going to try to cut it off at the top of the hour. So we've got about 12 minutes left.
Okay, fantastic. And then for those of you who have asked questions that we haven't addressed yet, we will be sure to either answer them verbally or we'll make sure that we answer them before we wrap up today.
Awesome. So I just kind of refreshed this. So notice that I chose the role level of designer and I have a rate of 115. I'm going to drop in, let's say 10 hours here as well. So there's 3 values that I have here. I have 1,300 or 1,500 at the top, 10 hours, 150. I then have 10 hours specifically for Laura at 130, that's 1,300. I then have 10 hours for the designer role at 115, that's 1,150. If I do, let's give one other example. Let's say I put 10 hours here, but I'm having a conversation with the client and they say, and I tell them, you know what, for admin time for this job, I'm only going to charge you 100 even. Now, what would happen if I were to put in a timesheet for each of these services? So I have account service, design, web development, and administrative. As I mentioned, when I enter a timesheet into the system is going to look at my specific rates page. This is where the system is going to look to find the value. So if it looks here and it finds a value here, it's going to use that value. So when we look at this account service, 10 hours at 150, if I put in 10 hours of work, the actual value is going to be $2,000. Design, Laura here specifically entered, estimated for 10 hours at 130. If I put in 10 hours, it's going to come in at $2,000 because I have a rate of 200. We did an override amount, 10 hours at $100. Again, if I put in a timesheet against this, it's going to be $200 per hour. Now, if somebody else who did not have value, so let's say that Sarah here starts putting in time. Well, the system's going to look here and it's not going to find anything. So it's going to use the default rate to value the time. So it doesn't care if you've put in an override for the rate here. It doesn't care if you put in an override dollar amount or if you've chosen a role or a staff person with a specific rate. When Sarah puts in a timesheet, it's going to look into the admin section. It's going to look and see what value are we finding here. If we're not finding a value, use this rate. And that's how it's going to be calculated. Now, this is how I highly recommend doing it. I don't recommend that you adjust rates on the fly on your estimate when you're setting up jobs. If if I build out an estimate here using a whole bunch of different rates based on what I think it's going to take to complete the job, and it's coming out to $94.50, and the client says to me, you know what, I really need you to do this for $9,000 flat. instead of me going and playing with rates, I can put in overrides, and I can say, okay, well, they needed 9,000 flat. Let's drop copywriting to 1,200, and then let's drop project management to 1,350. I'm entering dollar amount overrides, which is then allowing me to get to my 9,000 flat. Now, when I track time against this, the system, again, is going to look in the admin section and use the values it finds there to multiply by the number of hours to give me actual amounts. And what it's going to allow me to see is that if I'm billing a fixed fee of $9,000, maybe $4,500 up front and $4,500 upon completion, and then at the end of the day, when all is said and done, I'm going to be able to look and see, okay, well, we spent about the amount of time that we estimated as far as the hours are concerned, but the value of the work is significantly higher than $9,000 because we had senior people working on it. We had people working on these two items that we lowered our price on by using a dollar amount. Now, one thing I'll mention cautiously is that there is a setting in the system that will basically tell the system to look to this page to find the rate. What that means is that if I come in here and drop this to 125, that any staff person who enters a timesheet against this, the system's going to use 125. That only works if you basically have one blended rate, you have no staff rates, no roll rates, and you tell your account managers that they can play with hourly rates as a bargaining chip and a negotiation tool. I cannot stress enough how much I advise against this, but I do understand that sometimes you need to work that way. There's sometimes an agency needs to work that way. This is very black and white. This is one or the other. You need to choose, do you want the system looking here, or do you want it to look into the admin section? And it is much better for the system to be looking into the admin section to find the rate, to place the value of the work, and for you to be entering overrides here as dollar amounts in order to come up with values to win bids and to win work with clients. And of course, just to give you a really quick example, if I were to go ahead and add a timesheet to my job here, I'll just realize I'm logged in as administrator. If I enter a timesheet against my job here, under, let's say, project management for 1 hour, as I said earlier, the value is $200. If I go back to my jobs financials tab, notice here that I have project management, 10 hours estimated. We dropped in an override amount of $1,300. I have 1 hour actual at $200. If I were to finish the rest of this work off and drop in 9 more hours, my actual is going to be $2,000, and that's going to be $650 more than the estimate. But that may or may not affect how you bill it. You might just bill them the $1,350. But that is how the system looks at the admin section to find those rates. It's a lot to take in. Emma, I just want to check in. What are some of the best questions that we should go ahead and answer at this time? I'm happy to talk about system-specific stuff, or we can go back to the financial calculations.
Okay, yeah, that would be great. Let's try to address the questions from Jenny and Shirley that came in earlier. So I'll go with Shirley's first here. So Shirley had asked, and this was back referencing those PowerPoint pages you had up, is the billable staff hours that you use, the 1,600 per year, or 87% a standard required hours in the industry? Or I think that was a calculation you had come up with, yes?
The 1,600, actually, I did not come up with that.
Okay.
That is coming from Second Wind, as 1,600 hours. And I'm surprised to hear that it's such a high percentage. To be honest, I've never really calculated that 1,600 hours as a percentage. And if it is that high, it actually contradicts some things I've said in the past around efficiency targets. But I have been told and informed by our friends at Second Wind that 1,600 hours is a good target for billable staff. And we could take a look and see, we could run some calculations here and basically figure out, okay, well, what is the total amount of hours that might work in a year? So we basically would take and we'll make it really simple here. We'll say 49 weeks in the year multiplied by 40 hours in a week. It's coming out to 1,960. 1600 divided by 1960. So it's coming out to 81 or about 81.5% as just based on my quick calculation there, assuming that someone's going to work about 49 working weeks in the year, it's coming out to about 81%. So that sounds about right to me. That's kind of what I was expecting. So I guess 1600 as a percentage, it differs from agency to agency. If you work 48 weeks in the year, or there, a person, I mean, 49 weeks in the year is kind of looking at like 1 or 2 weeks of vacation plus holidays. If you want to, of course, you might want to account sick days, 2 weeks of vacation a year plus holidays, and maybe the agency takes all of the week of Christmas off. Well, then all of a sudden 1600 is a much higher percentage of the total hours that they're working, right? So it just depends on your agency, but I find 1600 to be a pretty decent industry standard.
Great. Thank you, Mark. This one from Jenny, which I think is great as well. If you could just re-clarify when you would use the agency blended rate versus the individual staff rate or department rate. I know you went through that, but if you could maybe restate that for us, that would be amazing.
Yeah, definitely. So, the agency blended rate is it's the default, right? It's um, what you should be using when you're not wanting to have other factors contribute. So if you've decided as a company, you know what, we're going to keep our rate structure simple, and this is applicable for a lot of companies that do a lot of fixed priced or project-based billings where you're charging a fixed flat fee for your work, which I find is really common these days. Then the blended rate makes a lot of sense because you're not charging them based on time materials. You're not charging the client based on the value of the actual time tracked. You're charging them based on an agreed upon estimated amount. The rates per staff person I find is a bit more sophisticated. It usually allows you to capture more of the actual value of the work that you've done. So, that's a case where I find it's more applicable if you're charging time and materials, and you're going to charge them based on the value of the actual work that you've done. But it can also be applicable if you just want to be more accurate with valuing your work. So it's kind of one or the other, right? Like, I mean, you can use the blended rate to estimate. So when you have a blended rate in the system, that's your default rate, and you're creating an estimate, it's blended from all of your staff, right? So, you are putting in hours that you think it's going to take, and then the client signs off on it, and that's what you're going to bill them. But then if you have staff rates in the admin section, as I mentioned, so, you created an estimate and used the default rate, but you have staff rates in the system. So when people are tracking time, it's looking and finding these values, which is that staff person's specific billing rate. And what that can allow you to do is look at each job and say, okay, well, this job we estimated $10,000. We ended up completing it with the work being done by a bunch of junior people, and it ended up, we have a billable actual of about $9,000. So that's a lot of profit, because I'm not talking about a cost of $9,000. I'm talking about a billable actual of $9,000. So you came $1,000 under, you made a bunch of money on it. Whereas another job, the same thing, we estimated maybe $9,000, using our blended rate, but because of other responsibilities, we had to pull in a bunch of our senior people in order to finish this off. And when they tracked their time, the system looked and found their higher rates. And on that job, we actually spent, as far as billable actual, about $14,000 on it because we had our senior staff working on it. So, using the staff rates is a more sophisticated way of operating, and it allows you to have a better insight into what the actual value of your work is. So if you can do that, you can keep it clean, great. But the number one thing as far as function point is concerned is keep it clean, know the rate section, study those 3 pages that we looked at today, and make sure you understand how they relate to each other. And if you ever come here and you find something that doesn't make sense, hop on it right away. Don't, go speak to your CFO, find out is that right, make sure that this page here is clean if you're going to try to use individual staff rates when calculating billable actuals.
Okay, Mark, I do have a couple more. Should we keep talking and get those wrapped up and then let you know, and if people need to jump off, we understand, and the recording will be available? What would your preference be?
Let's go for another like 4 minutes here. Let's just go to 5 after,
Okay.
and then we'll address anything that we haven't afterwards after
Okay,
that.
and totally understand if people need to jump off, and we'll keep going here for a bit to get these questions answered. Obviously, this is a pretty big topic. So we had one here, just back to the system, confirming that you are suggesting people do not mess with the rates when you're estimating, but better to change the final override amount if you need to adjust. Is that the message you're sending?
Most definitely, yes. Again, there is a setting in the system that allows you to tell the system basically ignore everything in the admin section. Now, when you add an estimate, the rates that pop in here, now this one, because I've added roles and staff, you'll notice there's some different rates. But when you add an estimate, the rates that fill in here come from the admin section. There is a setting in the system that allows you to say, if I muck around with these, then use these new custom rates I've created on the fly. Um, if you absolutely need to go that route, great, but I totally advise against it. And if you do not have that setting switched on, then the system is going to look to the admin section. So anything that you put in here is going to be used to calculate an estimated value, but the value of the actual work you do is not going to be using those values. So I recommend that you, instead of adjusting the hourly rates when you're changing estimated values, whether it's a negotiation period or anything like that, to adjust the overrides, the dollar amount overrides. So, as far as the creation of that is concerned, you are putting in amounts here. Like I said, I had 1,500 and I needed to come down, so I dropped in an override of 1,200, and that's how I'm coming down on that price. Um, Now, let's say you have a situation where you're doing a retainer with a client, and you say to the client, "Well, our hourly fee is $150," and they say, "Well, we want to sign a 1-year long retainer with you, and we're looking at about 50 hours per month, but we're only going to sign this contract if you come down on the hourly rate. We want you to come down to 130." If you come to an agreement with a client like that, and you're thinking, okay, well, this is now a rate I've established with this client that's going to be used for an entire year of their retainer services. The smart thing to do there would be to go and create a rate category. Go and create a category and call it retainer rate, or my fictitious client in the system is North Shore Auto Group. Call it the NAG retainer rate, and that is now used anytime you do a retainer for the North Shore Auto Group. So in situations where you do need to adjust rates because they've been negotiated with clients for a long-term relationship, create a rate category specific to that client. Don't adjust rates on individual estimates on the fly. You're just going to create confusion for yourself when you go to look at reports later on.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. And this is a good last one, probably, coming in asking, how is the cost and profitability of a job affected when you use different rates?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It just depends on how you bill. Sorry, can you repeat that just one more time?
Yeah, of course. How is the cost and profitability of a job affected when you use different rates? Now, in my mind, the cost probably wouldn't change, but the profitability probably would, depending, I guess, if you had different rate cards going on.
That is correct. So that actually, that's a great last question because it bleeds into next week's webinar. So the cost does not change. So the cost rates in the system are set. Each staff person is going to have a specific cost rate. Now, if they get a raise in their salary, that cost rate is going to adjust, and it's going to go up, and you're going to want to adjust their cost rate accordingly. But the cost rate is stagnant. It doesn't change. Every staff person has one cost rate in the system. So if you have different rate categories or different rate scenarios, and a staff person putting in a timesheet might have a value than a different timesheet they entered on a different job or something like that, the billable value can be affected, but the cost value never is. So as far as the profitability concerned, the profitability is determined based on how much you invoice compared to the cost. So if I estimate 10 hours on 150 and come out to $1,500, and I invoice for $1,500 and the cost was $500, then I've made $1,000. Now, if I estimate $1,500 and I put in a bunch of time, and the amount of time I put in comes into $3,000, but I only invoiced 1,500, my cost is still $1,000. So, the rates affect the profitability if you bill based on those rates. And if you're billing based on a fixed price, the way that those rates are going to affect the profitability is if you use those rates to come up with the fixed price. So I guess it's just important to keep that in mind. The profit is comparing the cost value of the work to what was billed, to the client. So the thing that's going to affect whether the profit goes up or down is if you allow the rates to affect what was billed to the client, whether you're billing to actuals or if you're using the rates in order to determine a fixed price. So the rates are going to affect the profit if they affect what you bill the client. The costs are always the same. And as far as cost rates are concerned, that is a topic for next week. Same bat time, same bat channel, Thursday at noon. I'm actually going to be conducting that webinar from Mexico City. I'm visiting a client that we have in Mexico City, doing some work for them there, and I'm going to be conducting that webinar from their office. So I'm going to be, maybe having a margarita while I, talk about cost rates with everybody.
You will not be having a margarita. I won't allow it.
Maybe I will.
And you will not, Mark. No. Okay. Well, we should let people go. We'll get the recording up later today or tomorrow. Thanks in advance to our marketing team for that. Mark, thank you. This is obviously a big topic and maybe one we need to even break into smaller chunks, given that we've notoriously, as we do, gone pretty over time today. But you have amazing information today, and you are just a wealth of knowledge about this stuff.
Well, thank you so much. I love talking about this type of stuff, and it's complicated topics. So I'm always interested in talking to agencies so I can learn more and they can learn from me. So if anybody does have any questions, reach out to us, let us know, and I'll be happy to set something up.
Yeah, fantastic. Just you can reach us at success@functionpoint.com. If you have ideas about other webinars you'd like to see, we're happy to hear that as well. So yeah, Mark, next time, same bat time, bat channel next week for all about cost rates. And thank you so much again.
No problem. One thing I want to do really quickly here, just take me 1 second, is open up Second Wind Online. Again, that is secondwindonline.com. Be a better agency. They are a wealth of knowledge. The team there, Tony Mikey's and his team, does a great job of really making this stuff digestible. So they do a much better job of it than I do. So if you think the stuff if you like this type of stuff that I'm talking about, I learned it all from them. And they teach it better than I ever could. So check them out, and you'll be happy that you did. Thanks, everyone, and we'll talk to you all next week.